Now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our event today. I'm Doug Berkey, Executive Director of the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies. This is a topic that I'm really happy we delved into. It's something that people talk about on the periphery constantly. We hear it on the Hill a lot, we hear it in other forums, and yet this, I think, is one of the first times anybody has tried to delve in English, translate concepts that are very complex, involve a lot of legal considerations and case history. And so I'm really proud of our authors because this is a very, very difficult one. Doing the interviews and all of that, sometimes it felt like we were speaking to folks speaking a different language. And so they did a fantastic job delving that into something I think should be really useful in the policy and budget community here in town as they try to chart a path forward. So with that, over to our team.
Thank you. So the issue of data rights, a lot of people look at that and say, my goodness, that's less interesting than watching paint dry, because at least paint changes color. But the fact of the matter is that this is a very significant challenge for both the Air Force and for industry to wrap our hands around and be able to solve and come to an appropriate balance, because we no longer live in an industrial age. We're now in an information age. And the types of data rights regulations and processes that the Air Force has been engaging with were fundamentally built for an industrial era Air Force. They're no longer appropriately adapted for the specific value propositions of today's combat capabilities. And that's important because the bottom line is the Air Force exists to pursue our national security objectives. In order to support our national defense strategy, the Air Force has to be able to affordably acquire, operate, sustain, and maintain and modernize their equipment. And to be able to do that, in addition to support the national defense strategy, they have to have equipment that has sufficient capabilities and dominance vis-a-vis our peers, and in sufficient quantities as well. And that's why affordability is really important. At the same time, you can't have a healthy Air Force if you don't have a healthy defense industry. It really is a partnership there. And the motivations that the Air Force has in order to be able to affordably do the things that it needs to do and organize, train, and equip are beginning to become adversarial with industry with respect to data rights. Industry has to be able to protect their technical data, their computer software, and their intellectual property. Those things that are the secret sauce, the value propositions for industry to be profitable. If you cannot protect your intellectual property, you're going to discourage innovation within your defense industrial base. And if you discourage that innovation by negating the value of the intellectual property and the technical data and whatnot associated with that, then you are fundamentally bringing down the level of combat capability that the Air Force can deliver in defense of the National Defense Strategy. So there has to be a balance. We have to be able to achieve a balance that will result in a win-win for both industry and for the Air Force, because we're all in it together. The DFARS guidance appropriately seeks to develop this balance, to give this balance, right? In the interest of that, they seek to empower the Air Force, the services, to be able to acquire the data rights, the technical data, and the privileges associated with that, as well as limit the scope of how much they can procure and acquire. So that's really where the balance should be. And in the interest of that, they're asking the acquisition managers to then do this work up front, rather than wait until 10 to 15, 20 years down the road, or even after the contract has been awarded and they're working to close the negotiations. They're asking the acquisition managers to do this work up front. But the problem is how in an environment where we now are looking at programs that are 40, 50, 60 years in length, that they're expected to be within the force structure for that duration, how can you anticipate what technical data will be needed 40 years from now? How can you anticipate what privileges and licensing rights will be needed 40 years from now? So because acquisition managers at the beginning of the request for proposal and that evaluation, as they're shaping that, since they cannot anticipate and predict that, they're making a very broad reach, a very aggressive reach. If they don't know the specifics, then they're just going to ask for it all. And so that uncertainty is what is disrupting the current, the historic balance. A good picture of this, to give you a visual, is the B-52, right? Designed and acquired in the 1950s. You see the silver B-52 in the upper left-hand corner. That was really just an airplane. Yes, it delivered weapons, it had advanced capabilities for the time, but the Air Force never anticipated it becoming what it has in the bottom right-hand corner. Right? Who knew that you would be expecting a B-52 to be delivering laser-guided weapons, to have the sensors that it has, to have the computational capabilities, the processing power, the algorithms? So again, how do you know what you'll need in 40 to 50 years? This is the problem set. And it's not just about the technical data, it's also about the data rights, those licenses. So what can you do with the data that you've then acquired? Looking at the B-52, I think, really only enhances the problem set when you look at today's competitions. Now that we're no longer in the industrial age and we're now in the information age, the intersection between hardware and software is so closely integrated, so tightly integrated, that it's very difficult to pull apart. And the speed at which we're seeing computation, processing, algorithms advance, that only serves to complicate this particular problem. So what specifically is technical data? As you look at it, obviously it's going to be issues with product design, specifications, sort of materials, think about tech orders, but it's also important to note what is not technical data. It's not the blueprints. It's not the detailed process and manufacturing. Technical data is not something that allows someone else to build your widget, right? Because that would disrupt the intellectual property in that value center of industry. Furthermore, technical data is specifically by statute not computer software. It's not code. That's not included at all. And these are important because that process and manufacturing data and that computer software are really key to today's innovation competencies for industry to be able to deliver to the services, to deliver to the government. It's important for us to talk a little bit about Omote. So Omote is a colloquial acronym, refers to operations, maintenance, installation, and training. That is not, again, the blueprints, that's not your code. That's the information that the government needs to be able to know how to operate. So if you think in terms of a vehicle or a car analogy, that's your driver's manual that you get in the glove box when you buy your new car. The maintenance, that's the information that the government needs to be able to maintain it. So that's what your local garage mechanic, or when you go down to Barnes & Noble and buy your maintenance book on how to change the oil in your Chevy. Installation, that's what kind of power outlets you need, what kind of garage do you need to have. And the training is exactly that. How do you train people to be able to operate or to be able to maintain this? So this really comes down to a lot of the tech orders. Omote's important because it confers unlimited rights, unlimited privileges to the government. They can do whatever they want to with that. And it's also important because it's automatically entitled to the government. So if you begin to change the definition of Omote and what's included within that particular scope, you then begin to change how much the government has access to, and you also confer to that unlimited rights. And so this is actually a real sticky problem right now, because within that expanded scope and desire for technical data, we're seeing some blurring of the lines where it used to be fairly crisp. And that actually is a risk both for the government and for industry as well. Also, it's important to note that the funding source makes a difference in what kind of ownership, so the content, as well as the privileges, or the rights licensing that's associated. So whether or not it's a program of record and funded through a program of record and development, whether or not it's a cooperative research and development program, whether or not it's indirectly charged to the government through independent research and development, or if it's privately invested, that changes the scope of what the government is entitled to as well. And then finally, there are different kinds of licensing. Unlimited means the government can do anything that they want to with that information. Government purpose rights really limit the scope of how the government can use that data to really within the government itself. It cannot be shared outside the government. It's important to note that government purpose rights decay into unlimited rights after 5 years, so it's a graceful degradation. And that's an issue that we think is also really important to address, and we have some specific recommendations on that later on. Limited, again, is limited, and that's specific to how that contract negotiation is set up. And finally, specially negotiated is very customized and tailored regarding what rights are conferred to the government, what privileges are conferred through that negotiation. So I've got a picture of a Ford Thunderbird and then also a 1917 Tesla there. And this is really to demonstrate the dual challenges that the Air Force has in front of them, right? Because they have equipment that's legacy equipment from the industrial era, and B-52 and the T-Bird that I've got up there are the same era. You could take that T-Bird into your garage and work on it yourself. So data rights were not in the requirements that the technical data that the government owned, not nearly as much of a problem with the T-Bird, because they could pretty much work on itself. A car was a car and it was fairly intuitive. But how do you put automatic driving into a T-Bird? How do you begin to modernize that T-Bird so that it has performance capabilities similar to your Tesla? And now today we also have the Tesla, where that integration of software and hardware is so tightly connected that you really do need to have more appropriately scoped and defined data rights in order to be able to manage that for the future. So these are the problems that are facing the government and frankly also facing industry. Now let's complicate the issue even further by bringing in commercial data and commercial companies. As we've seen, the Department of Defense has had an initiative to try to bring in non-traditional companies into the defense arena. Those commercial companies even further complicate what to do with those data rights. And one of the problems that we're seeing now is because the government really doesn't fully have an appropriate process. They haven't grappled with how to adapt industrial era technical data requirements and the rights. They haven't been able to bring that acquisition process into the information age. As a result, we're seeing a lot of inconsistency with how the different program offices are approaching their current solicitations. Herb?
Thank you, Heather. As we said, not all acquisitions are created equal. In the course of doing this study, we reviewed a number of major programs that are in one stage of the acquisition process or another to get a sense of whether there is or is not consistency in the government's application of data rights assertions in various acquisitions. The four bullets on the slide here, this is not any official formulation, but it helps us to understand where the different kinds of things group if you begin to bend the different programs into different areas. And at the top, there are large purpose-built systems that simply have no civilian equivalent. You know, fighter aircraft, bombers, guided missiles. The second program the second bullet is an interesting group because that's where we tend to see the most crossover, at least in terms of large things that fly, with civil and commercial capabilities. This is where you see platforms, both helicopters, light aircraft, biz jets that are used for some military purposes or adapted to that, or also have large civilian markets that they also cater to. And then get into the non-flying programs. Theater Battle Management Core Systems, which is our principal command and control system in the AOC right now. Distributed Common Ground System, which accepts the feeds from our flying reconnaissance aircraft, are actually both classified as weapon systems. They're 100% IT-based. They're global and networked. And again, they have a different set of issues that is not necessarily common to the others. And at the bottom end of the scale, the only bottom as is listed on the slide, but they're just purely commercial things that the government buys that, in most cases, no particular data rights are required. It's the software that's going on your desk computer and the chairs you're putting in your office and things like that. Keep this in mind because as we go through this, I'll start walking through the programs. In our look at the programs, the most contentious issues tended to arise in the second bullet, which is an interesting thing. So these are the programs that we looked at specifically. And at the top of the list in the aircraft programs, there are three of significance that are in one stage of acquisition right now or the other. The UH-1 helicopter replacement program is to procure 84 helicopters for both VIP and executive transport here in the National Capital Region, and also for protection of missile silos out west. There are three primes currently in contention for this, and it's obviously in the late stages of acquisition. The TX trainer is to replace the T-38 aircraft. It's a planned aircraft buy of about 350 airplanes. And it's to prepare pilots for, to fly fourth, fifth, sixth generation fighters. The T-38 is basically built as an airplane to teach stick and rudder skills. And so it's not simply the age of the aircraft, but also its unsuitability for a lot of the advanced stages of pilot that are driving that acquisition. 5 competitors have been down selected to 3 right now, and that's still ongoing. The third one is the OAX. The OAX light attack experiment is just that. It's not a formal program yet. It's to develop counterinsurgency aircraft to operate in permissive environments and try to free up some of the higher end fighters that we're currently using for that activity. We get to space and missile programs after that. One is, frankly, a program that's been ongoing for some time, and that's the EELV since the 1990s. The current acquisition that's on the street for that is to procure 5 national security space launches. And then also there's an initiative to, as I think a lot of you know, to end reliance on the Russian RD-180 rocket engines and go to a U.S.-built system. So that's what's contained in that. Ground-based strategic deterrent, the new ICBM for the Air Force, is right now, there are 2 contracts out to Boeing and Northrop Grumman to do maturation over a 3-year period, after which they'll down select to a single vendor. It's going to be an all-new missile. They'll reuse the silos after refurbishment, but it's still a large and complex program. Then get to the non-flying programs. Open architecture DCGS. Open architecture DCGS is an attempt to evolve this to an open system that can rapidly evolve. Distributed Common Ground System actually grew out of the older contingency airborne reconnaissance system. It's a highly proprietary system, and there's a lot of that legacy within DCGS. So the Air Force wants to get to an open architecture with that so it can more rapidly evolve. And finally, TBMCS is the most immature of these. It's right now the only things that are actually on the street are broad area announcements of AFRL looking for new technologies, but eventually to evolve TBMCS into something more suitable to handle multi-domain command and control. So we have a wide spectrum of kinds of solicitations here, and as it turns out, a wide spectrum of data rights assertions and approaches to data when we actually get down to the specifics. So this is what they look like in acquisition terms. And you can see at the top of the slide, the UH-1 and the TX trainer are 2 that are currently in acquisition. And you recall Heather's discussion of Omote, organization, maintenance, installation, and training data that's normally asserted with any aircraft acquisition. It's the technical data that you need to have to operate and maintain the system. In the DFARS, data rights are asserted over 2 kinds of data. One is technical data. That's what's in Omote. The other is software. Software by statute is not technical data. It has a separate set of rights governing it. So what's occurred in these 2 particular programs is that the Air Force, in asserting the Omote clause in the model contract, included software within the Omote that had to be delivered. And as Heather indicated, Omote is also delivered with unlimited rights. So the effect of this is to essentially require a vendor bidding on these programs to turn over both the technical data and to turn over all the software associated with the system with unlimited rights. The Air Force recently came out with a letter saying that's not exactly what we meant. And they've clarified that to say now that at least for the software delivered under that clause, the vendor, in fact, can assert rights for that software. So that's a guidance letter. We'll see what follows after that. I think this is an evolving issue. But so when I get back to our earlier discussion about the overreach, these are squarely in the middle of that particular group, the second bullet on the slide. And recall also that it's not just the primes that are affected. Even in programs of this size, you can have a couple of hundred or more lower tier suppliers that all have to accept all of the flow downs. And if any of them do not, the prime will have to go back and requalify a new supplier to handle that particular thing. So it has levels of complexity that are add to cost and are difficult to deal with. The OAX, as I indicated, is not a formal program yet, so there is no data strategy that's been asserted for it. And interesting here, General Polakowski has even said this might be an example of a program that we basically just operate for a few years and then throw it away when it's no longer useful. Her words exactly. So we'll see how that one turns out. Going to the missile programs, we see something different. If you look at EELV, if you look at the ground-based strategic deterrent, the data rights clauses associated in both of these programs conform very specifically to the DFARS. There is no attempt to put software into the technical data, and you've got the ability to assert specific rights over the software as it comes into the program. And then as we get down to the lower two, open architecture, DCGS, and future command and control, those are effectively going to end up being open architecture systems within the RFI, which is on the street right now for open architecture DCGS. The government has stated their intent simply to pay people to develop software for them. So the government will own the rights to that. Future command and control, TBD at this point. It's too far out to be at a data right stage, but I would anticipate that it'll probably follow what DCGS does. That'll be a pathfinder in terms of how that's handled in terms of data rights and development. A few observations, and let me preface that by saying, we've been throwing the word intellectual property around a bit in this discussion, and I'm going to use it again. It's important to understand what we mean by intellectual property, and I will say that, I spent a lovely afternoon with about 15 intellectual property attorneys learning about this stuff. I did learn. My head hurt when I was done, but it was instructive. But IP is the secret sauce. It is the proprietary information that is in technical data, the hardware, it's in the software. It's protected by either patent or copyright. And this is what gives a company its competitive edge in the market. This is what one company has that another doesn't have. It's what they put their money into developing. And so there is a quantifiable value associated with intellectual property. And, bottom line, at the end of the day, this is what this discussion is actually about. So as we look through the different programs, we found inconsistencies in the data rights approaches. Now, you could say some of this may be explained by the fact that, it's one kind of system or another. But certainly the data rights assertions could not be explained by the complexities of the system. Ground-based strategic deterrent and ICBM is arguably at least as complex as any of the aircraft programs would look like, and probably more so, and yet the government did not see the need to assert software data rights to be included as an unlimited deliverable in that. So it is inconsistent at this point, and we're eager for an explanation. The government says it wants to reduce barriers to commercial technology. That's a worthy goal. We all agree with it. But it's not clear that the government actually understands intellectual property valuation. It's not clear that the government actually understands the role of profit in attracting capital to continue to innovate. And this is a critical thing that needs to come to closure. This is how companies continue to innovate and how they stay in business. At the same time, most government people have not worked in industry. The reverse is not true. So the levels of understanding are not the same. Innovation is, we throw the word around a lot. It's obviously key. But not all innovation is the same. There is continuous evolutionary innovation. We continue to take a capability, we improve it, we make it a better one. We replace a fighter with a new fighter, we replace a bomber with a new bomber. They have lots of things in them, but it's still doing the same function. That is absolutely essential to sustaining and growing the industrial base. But there's also discontinuous disruptive innovation. And some of that happens within the conventional, traditional defense industrial base. A lot of it does not. And in order to attract those companies to come to the Department of Defense and offer their wares, it has to be attractive to them. These are companies that frankly do not need the United States Air Force to be financially successful. They can sell to lots of vendors out there. So but these companies will not place their IP at risk in order to support the United States government. So bottom line is, yes, companies are in competition to do business with the Air Force. The Air Force is also in competition. We have to be clear about this. The Air Force is in competition with other buyers to attract the best talent to its market. So it has to set the conditions for success in order to do that. And with that, I will turn it over to my sage colleague, General Stutzriem, to finish this out.
I just want to make this point that when Herb sat with those 15 attorneys, I abandoned him, and I didn't want any part of it. I appreciate all that good work, Herb.
And you still own that
I do. So this brings us to where this discussion to really a call for action for a stronger defense. And let me preface it by saying that the Air Force, the government in general, is acting rationally. The desire to have affordable sustainment, Congress is pushing on the Air Force very hard to obtain that. That's a rational goal. And industry is also acting very rationally in the arena of data rights in that it wants to protect the IP it doesn't need to give up to remain competitive in the defense market and the global market. So the goal is for both. There is a balance to obtain the best solutions for the warfighter. And of course, this is in a world that's becoming increasingly dangerous. So let me talk to my former commanders, because they would want me to put this in one slide, a couple lines. That is, there needs to be an enforced but a disciplined process. There's plenty of regulation. There's plenty of sub-processes. There are plenty of resources for acquisition officers to go to, but is there really a disciplined process being operated when it comes to defining requirements? That workforce, the engine behind making sure that these are defined and procured properly, is it prepared? Are we deriving those requirements, and is it based upon a life cycle strategy? As Heather said, it could be a strategy that goes out 40 years. That's hard. Or it could be, as Ellen Palikowski said about the light combat aircraft, simply during the lifespan of those airframes and not to be extended in any way. So what do we do? What do we recommend? First of all, it's obvious from our study that a balance is needed. One does not exist as it is right now. The Air Force is, in our survey, sometimes paying too much. Sometimes they're buying what they don't need, and that's probably the majority of the cases. They're driving up costs and not defining those requirements well. They're reducing competition, as Herb said, which means snuffing out some of the avenues of innovation for those vendors who rather pursue the global market rather than jump into the defense market. And we had a couple of technology companies that said had they been subjected to overreach of data rights, they would bail on that defense market. So the way ahead is more about not restating more policy or developing more policy, but really tuning that engine, and that's what our recommendations are about. So in terms of process and the preparation of the workforce, there needs to be an immediate move to develop a specialized corps of acquisition officers that specialize in intellectual property rights, data rights, and data requirements. It would be very expensive to stop and try to reset, reorganize, and retrain the acquisition corps and our contracting officers. So we believe this is the best avenue to have change in the short term. And supporting, and as you know, the acquisition and contracting piece of this is very compartmented. The human resources is very compartmented. These officers would be cross-functional, providing that advice and fine-tuning of that machine. In the hands or in the toolkit of that specialized group would be developed templates. We're recommending templates that can be varied based upon the unique needs of acquisition programs. And that is a translation of many oversight regulations and toolkits that are out there right now. There's a lot of talk about how this is functioning, so we recommend further that the data requirements process is reviewed formally during all acquisition programs, but more importantly, a system set up to actually take a look at the lessons, the mistakes, aggregate that information, and disseminate it across all acquisition programs. Now, underpinning this, you may be knowledgeable that the Undersecretary of the Air Force has contracted, or not contracted, but assembled a cross-functional working group to look at data rights and data requirements. This is going to fail, in our opinion, if industry isn't engaged at the same time. And so we have in our study recommendations several recommendations for bringing government industry together in this discussion in different ways. There are some other specific recommendations in the report that includes one that Heather brought up, government purpose rights. It is smart for both government and for industry to see the government redefine what it calls government purpose rights. For example, the duration, to put it more in line with what commercial industry uses. The use of specially negotiated licenses is a smart way to go. We found it's not used enough. It's a tailored approach that allows the government to work with industry to better define those requirements, to get what it needs and not buy more than it needs. And then another area we found is frustrating good acquisition is where commercial products are slightly modified. The Air Force wants to buy something, but then grab all the rights to that slightly modified commercial product. Not smart, it's expensive, but more importantly, it's driving competition out in some key areas where policy says, yes, look at more of the innovative products that are already on the market to reduce cost. They're modified slightly, and then they go back up in cost because of overreach of data rights. Finally, in this arena, there are two panels that Congress has impaneled. 809, which is all about intellectual property, of which Herb is an expert, and then the 813 panel, which is looking at data rights. We've looked through their initial work, and we believe this is something that you need to keep your eyeball on. Our recommendations are congruent with where they're going. In this, as they work, the topic of data rights, especially requirements definition, and the ability of the government to do that properly in all acquisition programs is going to be, that discussion is going to be extended when they come out with their work. So this is a summary of our recommendations. We believe this brings a balance to a very important topic where we get to what government wants, affordable sustainment, what industry wants, the ability to retain as much of its secret sauce, special sauce, as it can to remain competitive both in the defense market and also in the global market. And with that, we will answer any questions you might have. Yes, sir.
Great work. I think, as I've read this and as I looked at the presentation, clearly, in my view, what the government wants is to not be locked in, and to whether it's TBMCS, DCGS, whatever, not be locked in to a company for the duration of the program. What industry wants is to be locked in. I mean, we need to be clear. And on the one hand, when the government talks about software, firmware, data rights, and is crafting an acquisition strategy, it ought to be tailored to, we don't want to be locked in. So whatever, and if it go back, change the DFAR or whatever, on the government side, they need to do that. Because otherwise, right now it's a a cul-de-sac discussion on, we want data rights, we want data rights, we want code, we want and then you say, well, so what? Now that you have it, are you locked in or not? Well, we really don't know because we didn't build it. On industry's case, there is the intellectual property piece to some extent. But again, I think the motivational driver is we want to, if we win this contract, we want to shape it such that we're locked in. And the government has no choice but to continue with us. We'll use the intellectual property discussion, which truthfully has a lifespan of maybe 5 years. And after that, somebody else has mirrored it. Or we'll use all kinds of other discussions. The commercial companies, in my view, use this as a reason not to do business with the government, which is partially true. But more importantly, I think, it's they don't want the oversight. The commercial companies don't want to be subject to the DFARS, audits, all those things, and the overhead costs associated with doing business with the government. So they'll sub. They'll do, you know, in the classic example, I think, over the years was Microsoft, for the longest time, refused to do a government contract. They would sub, they would provide products, but they would not do it under a government contract. They'd do it through another vendor because they didn't want to be audited, they didn't want the overhead costs and the limitations associated with it. That needs to come out because at the end of the day, we're going to have a lot of heated discussions over data rights without understanding what are driving the interests of both the government and industry.
We up? There we go. All true. I mean, it's if you distill this down to the fundamental, the government doesn't want vendor lock, just as you said, and industry would like a lot of it. But I point to the F-35 program. Lieutenant General Bogdan in 2016, you know, talked about this very thing. There's a very good article in NDIA's magazine where he talks about, you know, he comes in, he's in the program, and he goes, we don't really know what we own. We don't own. It's slowing us down. It's inflating costs. So the balance to this, the fundamental is, the foundation of the discussion is what you described perfectly. The way ahead is that there's not a lot of competence on the government side of this. And in fact, as I said, the acquisition, the human resource, has plenty of regulation. There's DFARS everywhere. There's toolkits everywhere. But is a process enforced that can be translated into contract language that both industry and government can sit at the table and go, oh yeah, I do own that, or no you don't, you're going to pay more. Haha, I got you locked in. You know, that's really what has to get fixed in this discussion before either government can claim we're free of vendor lock or industry can say the opposite. You know.
I'll respond to that as well. Clearly, the government wants vendor lock, and industry would be interested to be able to have that government locked in as a customer. No one's going to be happy in the appropriate balance. Government will be unhappy, and industry will be a little bit unhappy because you won't have a binary 1 or a 0 in either of those cases. I think the situation is that there's a lack of dialogue right now between the government as they go through the RFI process and they develop the solicitation and they develop the capabilities requirements. As we look at, for example, on the performance and capabilities requirements process, there's a growing and more robust conversation between industry and government regarding what the art of the possible is. But a similar data requirements dialogue and process does not exist right now. So there's no way of knowing what the appropriate balance is between where you need to set the data, the technical data content ownership, and the rights and privileges and licenses associated with that. We believe that that will be different and unique to each individual program, because part of what you're doing in trying to determine the level of technical data content and the licenses associated is how do you achieve the best outcome for the long term. Right now, because we don't fully understand, the government doesn't fully understand the requirements, and frankly, they don't have the competencies the engineering competencies to do the program integration for the long term, that's a very compelling argument to allow industry to retain a greater balance, a greater percentage of that content, because as experienced integrators, industry has that expertise. Owning the technical baseline is about growing that engineering, that integration expertise within the U.S. government. So should we slide that a little bit further to the left or further towards the government side as they begin to grow those abilities indigenously? Potentially, but also understand that the more that the government takes, the less healthy and the less innovative industry will be. So although the government doesn't want to be subjected to vendor lock, and very reasonably and appropriately so, they also need to have an understanding of what the unintended consequences of that overreach or of that aggressive desire for data rights will do in the long term for the health of the industrial base.
So I want to come back to a couple of your recommendations on government purpose rights and specifically negotiated licenses. I think I agree with the expiration timeline issue. That's already negotiable. You can already stretch that out. I've never had an instance where a government agency has said no to 10, 20, whatever the appropriate timeline is. Statute's been amended recently to push more towards specifically negotiated licenses. I think that's the right answer, I think for the reasons you've described. But I've heard a couple of you say the competency isn't there. How do we build it? How do we get that competency? Because specifically negotiated license rights are a scalpel. Great for open heart surgery, unless you put it in the hands of an unskilled surgeon, you probably kill the patient anyway.
Exactly. So we do actually have a recommendation that isn't specifically targeted towards specially negotiated licenses, but really is how do you develop that expertise both broad across the issues for data requirements and data rights, but also very deep. So how do you train them to be very skilled with that surgical device? We know that right now the resources and the manning does not enable the acquisition cadre to provide that kind of competency across the board, which is why one of our recommendations is to build a small group, a cadre of intellectual property, technical data experts within acquisition that would be closely tied with industry so they understood not just what the government needs were, but how that impacted industry. They understand the levers of how to incentivize and motivate industry. And they also understand the consequences of the types of data rights and the templates that they would then be helping craft, what that would have on the broader health of the defense industry. So we believe that hand-picking a small group to really have a deep knowledge, have that expertise, have the industry relationships, have a continuous dialogue, in some ways also potentially act as an ombudsman for these particular issues, that they would then be the resource that would help facilitate all of the data rights requirements and crafting through the solicitation and the RFP, the draft RFP. So they'd almost be like a traveling tiger team, if you will. We think that's the only reasonable way to begin to approach this as the government begins to really wrap their hands around how do they address data rights, move more towards specially negotiated licenses, and how to have this conversation about cost capability requirements as it pertains to that intellectual property.
More thing on this. As you know, to do a good contract, translate all of this into contract language, you almost have to be a copyright attorney litigator with an eyeball for making sure that contract language is meets the needs of both industry and the government. It's very difficult. So what Heather is saying is the notion that we're going to build acquisition officers that have master's degrees in engineering, law, and so forth. We just can't do that. But the expertise needs to be employed, and so we see these as integrators, this specialty team as integrators across the compartments of acquisition.
Just a comment. building on what John Huffbauer was saying, that I think the data rights question really obfuscates the real problem, which is trying to avoid a technical lock by the government. The other thing I'd point out is that the government owning the technical base is not a panacea. That you can end up with, now you're locked into a depot with civil servants that are there for 20, 30 years, and you're still not getting the innovation you need. So your point that the data rights and the ability to modernize, particularly in software systems, has to be on a program by program basis, and you're much better off, in my opinion, using commercial vendors and pushing it to the large OEMs that are able to green their force up a lot quicker to take advantage of technological innovation. The real problem with data rights and IP is the lack of S&T investment across the industrial base, and the failure because of the shift from government S&T investment to commercial and industry S&T investment. The government's in the position of pay me now or pay me later, right? They're not paying for the S&T so that they would own the IP themselves, so they have to buy it from industry, whether it's non-traditional defense contractors or traditional defense contractors or the like. So,
Can I just go part one of what you said, part one on an organic capability, so to speak, that's why getting the sustainment strategy right up front is so important. And if that strategy is, we'll contract it, well, great. Then, we write the contracts accordingly. But the problem is getting that assessment done. I think looking across many programs, that if you were to give a grade to, data rights, requirements, definition, if you graded the government, I don't know, D-, it's not going to be good. Go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of comments. First of all, owning the technical baseline doesn't mean owning all the data, right? Owning the technical baseline is a phrase basically to say that you have to take ownership. It's like saying I take ownership of the problem, which means that your program office has to have sufficient technical, business, and engineering insight into the program to effectively manage it. That said, one of the things that we saw is the whole business of securing the appropriate data rights at the beginning of a program. Now, there's language in the current NDAA which actually requires people to do that. That should be a brilliant flash of the obvious, but we found a number of cases where that simply wasn't done. And in one case, it was actually an Army program, not an Air Force program, but the Army decided later on to actually procure the data rights to a program they were already into. And they were quoted a price that was just about the same as what they paid for the program to start with. So getting these things done right at the outset is, I think, the appropriate thing to do, and now it's required. That said, as General Stutzriem indicated, this is not something you can expect every acquisition officer to have knowledge of. You really have to develop a special core of expertise and then manage them appropriately to do this right.
And I'll just make a quick closing remark on that question. As you've indicated, for the past several decades, the services have proven themselves to be very poor integrators. So they don't have the competencies to be able to take on that engineering ability to do what the OEMs, what the primes are specifically and specially positioned to be able to provide. So that's a value proposition that the traditional defense primes have that the service does not. And so part of this question of owning the technical baseline, which, as Herb mentioned, is not about blueprints. It's fundamentally about that engineering expertise and program management expertise. That's lacking right now. And the question is that something that, although it's been put forward as an initiative, is that really the best use for the long term of Air Force's limited resources? But a second piece of that we haven't discussed a whole lot is IP valuation. So what is it worth what is that data worth, that intellectual property worth? And as General Stutzriem mentioned, there is no competency within the Air Force to really understand what the dollar value for intellectual property is for that long term. And that's something that they would need to be able to develop a credible IP valuation strategy, which is not a should cost, but actually is a real cost to that company. Because if you undervalue intellectual property, you're going to essentially force either that company out of the industrial base, or you're going to diminish their ability to innovate.
I know everybody's going to leave this room and go out and buy a big batch of data rights. Is that true? Is that...
Hi. Good morning. The Air Force has really embraced on this idea of open architecture, open mission systems. Did your study look at that aspect of it with regard to data rights to enable those kind of capabilities?
To a limited extent. Data rights partially accrues to how it was paid for. Right? So, if the software was developed on a company's nickel, that they invested in it, and they own certain rights to it. If the government pays you to do it, that's a different set of rights. They're going to own the body of the IP in that. So you at least have that particular difference. I'm not sure what else I can add to that.
So although this was not a real focus of our analysis, because we were looking specifically more at current competitions and the acquisition approaches towards data rights and the actual data requirements as well, first blush reaction regarding open mission systems is that should enable companies to maintain greater ownership of their technical data and of their intellectual property, because it would be more easily integrated through those standards of OMS.
And OMS is a strategy, right? I mean, it's a design strategy that allows rapid modernization or modification and sustainment. So that decision to go there at the baseline of the program is priced in. It's and that's where we have to do that right at the front. So OMS is simply a strategy. In my mind, everything else is still valid in terms of, I think, our recommendations.
Yes, Air Force officials have said a few times in recent congressional testimony that they might be looking for help from Congress in this area. And I know this may be reflected a bit in your recommendations, but are there specific, do you know of what specific policy help the Air Force might be looking at or looking for from Congress? And also, did you consider any of that as you went through the study?
Let me start by saying no. What we looked at was pressure from Congress on the Air Force to make changes in this area. So I think I'd characterize our study, and correct me if you think I'm off here, our study is more oriented toward that response to Congress than recommending to Congress more regulatory assistance in this arena. Yeah, I don't know if that's it.
Is this thing on? Question about, you mentioned the specialized corps of acquisition officers specializing in data requirements and stuff. To what extent do you think it would be valuable to actually talk to the government personnel at the software sustainment facilities, Tinker and Dahlgren and stuff, to get them to the table when you're talking about negotiating these data rights?
Certainly there would be value. Obviously it wouldn't hurt. And I think in developing a strategy certainly would behoove the government to capture as much existing knowledge as possible in the formulation of that strategy. That That said, the expertise tends to be in private industry. And so that's obviously going to contribute significantly to developing any particular strategy as it comes forward.
I did, I must have blacked it out of my memory. I did spend about 2 hours on the phone with an attorney with General Levy out at Sustainment Command talking about this topic. I don't think I said 3 words during the 2 hours. There was so much wrapped up in the discussion of the readiness of the workforce to do this kind of sophisticated work. By the way, that attorney is he's a reservist that works as a copyright litigator. So the guy's smart, and I think once again, there's a lot of talent across the Air Force in particular to work this issue, but it falls on the 3 and 4 stars to really grasp it and make the type of systemic changes that need to be made. Of course, completely revamping something, a system such as acquisition, is probably going to fail, but there are instruments that can slowly integrate and bring it to a place that, those places we've recommended in the paper.
And when it comes specifically to software and software maintenance, when you're getting, for example, an update to your iPhone, you're fixing bugs, you're essentially getting a new modified software, right? Software maintenance actually restores the software program back to its original state. So there are significant issues that are associated with doing that kind of software sustainment, if you will. And I think the bottom line, it comes down to where are your centers of innovation? Where are you getting your most capability, your most creativity, and your best expertise? And that's what the broader approach should seek to optimize. Are you going to get that within those software centers in lifecycle management, or are you going to get that by attracting a broader array of companies to your defense industrial base and ensuring that they maintain that they're healthy because they're able to maintain what their value propositions are and their intellectual property? So it's a balance, certainly, but we need to more fully understand where those value propositions are uniquely for organic software work or within private industry.
Time for one more question. Okay.
Very good, thank you.
I'd like
so
to
much.
thank you all for coming today, and thank you to our panelists.